Chapter 3. A Descent into the Maelstrom. A modern retelling. The ways of God in nature, as in providence, are not as our ways, nor are the models that we frame any way comparable to the vastness, depth, and unfathomable nature of his works. Joseph Glanville. We stood on top of a towering cliff. The old man beside me looked so worn out that it felt like he could barely talk. Not long ago, he finally said, I could have guided you along this path as easily as the youngest among my sons, but 3 years ago, I experienced something that's unlike anything that's ever happened to anyone else, or at least, no one has survived to tell the tale. The 6 hours of terror I endured then have broken me down physically and mentally. You see me as an old man, but I'm not. It only took a single day for these black hairs to turn white, for my limbs to weaken, and for my nerves to fray. Now, I tremble at the slightest exertion and flinch at the sight of a shadow. I can barely look over this edge without feeling dizzy. The edge he referred to was steep and sheer, a drop of about 15 or 1600 feet. Nothing could entice me to come anywhere near it. The sight of him leaning precariously over the edge made my heart race. I immediately lay flat on the ground, gripping the grass around me, scared to even glance up at the sky, fighting the irrational thought that the mountain itself could give way under the strain of the wind. It took me a while to muster the courage to sit up and look out at the sea. You need to shake off these fears, the guide said. I brought you here to show you the site of the event I mentioned, and to tell you the full story right where it happened. Right now, we are on the Norwegian coast, he continued in detail. We're at 68 degrees latitude, in the Nordland province, in the desolate area known as Lofoten. The mountain we're on is Helseggen, which means cloudy ridge. Now, raise yourself a bit higher, just hold onto the grass if you feel wobbly, and look past the mist below us into the sea. I looked out, feeling dizzy, and saw ocean water so dark that it reminded me of the Sea of Darkness described by ancient geographers. It was an utterly bleak and desolate panorama. To the left and right, towering cliffs jutted out, their gloomy presence intensified by the white waves crashing against them, howling and screaming in an eternal cacophony. Just a few miles out to sea, I spotted a small, stark island. Closer to us was another smaller, jagged, and barren rock, surrounded by dark stones. The expanse of ocean between the distant island and the shore was oddly chaotic. Despite a strong wind pushing toward land, a ship in the distance struggled under the burden of the tempest, dipping out of sight. The water here didn't swell regularly. Instead, it was choppy and angry, crashing in all directions. The island you see in the distance is called Vora by the Norwegians, the old man explained. The one nearer is Moscow, and that one a bit north is Ambaaren. The others are Eilsen, Hotholm, Kildhelm, Swaven, and Buckholm. There's more. Between Moscow and Vora are Otterholm, Flimmen, Sandfelsen, and Stockholm. These are the real names, but why we bother naming these barren spots is beyond me. Do you hear that? Is the water changing? After taking in the view for about 10 minutes, I became aware of a loud noise, growing louder and resembling the moaning of a vast herd of animals. At the same time, I noticed the water's choppy state shifting into a strong current moving eastward. The current picked up speed, becoming turbulent. Soon, the entire sea, as far as Vora, boiled with madness, and the tumult was loudest between Moscow and the shore. There, the waters were seething and swirling, forming massive whirlpools, churning with an energy I'd never witnessed before. In mere minutes, the scene altered again. The surface appeared more turbulent, with whirlpools fading, and strange streaks of foam appearing where there had been none before. As time passed, these foam streaks spun, mixing, and eventually formed a massive whirlpool more than a mile wide. The edge of it shimmered with spray, but nothing seemed to draw into the dark, smooth abyss that spiraled down like a slick black wall inclined at a sharp angle, rotating with a force that sent out a terrifying noise, half shriek, half roar, far beyond anything the mighty Niagara would unleash. The mountain trembled, and I threw myself down on the ground, clutching at the sparse grass in sheer panic. This is definitely the infamous Maelstrom, I whispered to the old man. And we Norwegians call it the Moscow Strom, after the island of Moscow that's right in the middle of it. Any prior explanation of this whirlpool hadn't prepared me for the spectacle. One particular account by a man named Jonas Ramus might have been thorough, but there is no way it could convey the sheer magnificence and horror of what I was seeing. I'm not sure from where he gathered his observations, but it certainly wasn't from this mountaintop during a storm like this. Between Lofoten and Moscow, the water is about 36 to 40 fathoms deep, he wrote. But closer to Vora, it shallows out, making it dangerous for ships to navigate these rocky waters, even during calm weather. At high tide, the current flows powerfully from Lofoten to Moscow. The roar of the water cascades into the sea, disturbing the peace for miles, and any ship that gets too close gets pulled down and crushed against the rocks. The debris is only seen again after the tide returns, and tranquility is only found during the brief moments of slack water, which last no more than 15 minutes. A fierce storm can make it deadly to venture within Norway's mile of the Maelstrom. I wondered how he could even claim to know these depths so near the whirlpool. The 40 fathoms probably referred only to the channels close to the land. The center of the Moscow Strom had to be much deeper, more akin to an abyss. Gazing into that swirling dark water, I couldn't help but smirk at how naive Ramus's account seemed, especially tales of bears and whales being swallowed. It was apparent to me that even the biggest ship wouldn't stand a chance against that monstrous force and would vanish in an instant. People have offered various theories to explain this phenomenon. Some claim it's simply the collision of waves against rocks, causing the water to drop sharply, while others suggest there might be an abyss that connects to the globe's depths, though I found that idea ridiculous. I mentioned it to my guide, and was shocked to learn that while many Norwegians believed the theory, he thought it completely false and confusing. Now that you've seen the whirlpool for yourself, he said, if you can find a spot protected from the noise of the water, I'll share my own story about the Moscow Strom. I ducked behind a rock as he suggested and braced myself. My two brothers and I owned a small fishing vessel, a smack of about 70 tons. We would fish among the islands near Moscow, to Vora. In these turbulent waters, there are excellent fishing opportunities, if you're bold enough to take the risk. In fact, few in the Lofoten area dared venture to the islands like we did. Most fishermen preferred areas further down south, where they could catch fish safely without danger. We, however, took the gamble for the better catch. Our reward often made all the risks worthwhile. We kept our boat about 5 miles up the coast and, on clear days, we'd time our crossing of the main Moscow Strom channel to get there during slack water, then drop anchor close to Otterholm or Sandfelsen, where the currents weren't as wild. We'd wait until it was time to head back, making sure we had reliable winds in our favor. We only had to spend one night anchored due to a total calm, a rare occurrence, and once we waited out a violent storm that kept us stranded for a week and nearly starved us out. That trip was when we got sucked into the whirlpools, and our anchor dragged as we spun around wildly. It was a few days before we saw a terrible storm approaching us. July 10th, 18 – No one in this region will ever forget that day. The morning and afternoon were calm, giving no hints of the hurricane coming our way. My brothers and I had crossed to the islands around 2 p.m., loading our boat with fish that poured in more abundantly than ever before. At around 7, we sailed back just in time to catch the slack water that we knew was at 8. With a steady wind at our backs, we headed home, making good speed and feeling safe. Suddenly, we were taken aback by an unusual wind blowing over from Helsingin. Something we'd never encountered. A sense of uneasiness washed over me, but I didn't know why. We turned into the wind but couldn't make any headway. Just as I was about to suggest we go back, I saw a strange, copper-colored cloud forming on the horizon, rising fast. In less than a minute, we were engulfed by a storm. The gently blowing breeze stopped, replaced by a sudden quiet before the winds roared in. The darkness fell upon us, and we couldn't even see each other on the boat. You have no idea how fierce the storm was. Such a whirlwind is hard to describe. The oldest sailor in Norway wouldn't have experienced something like this. We had let our sails out, yet when the first gust of wind hit, both masts snapped clean off as if they'd been cleaved. My youngest brother had tied himself to the main mast for safety, but the force dragged him off as well. Our vessel was impossibly light, totally flat-decked except for a small hatch at the bow that we always battened down when crossing the Strom. Without that precaution, we would have sunk immediately, thoroughly overwhelmed by the water. I clung to the ring bolt near the foremast, instinctively knowing it was the best move in my panic. We were deluged for a while, and I held my breath, firmly gripping the bolt. As soon as I felt I could bear it no longer, I pushed myself up and gazed around, met by the sight of my brother, pale but alive, next to me. The moment felt joyous until he cried one word: Maelstrom. I can't describe the terror coursing through me in that moment. I trembled all over, knowing that we were headed straight for disaster. We calculated where we could cross the Strom safely, always making sure to wait above the current during calmer times, but now we were on a collision course, into the vortex. The strong winds that had first helped us now turned on us. We went up a massive wave, higher than I ever thought possible, and then we plunged down, feeling as though we were falling off a high cliff. As we went up, I caught only a quick glimpse. The Maelstrom was close ahead of us but looked unrecognizable, a chaotic and terrifying spectacle. The boat felt as if it was soaring through the sky before the violent descent took us. We were engulfed in foam as the boat turned sharply to the side, shooting us forward into the deathly whirl. I could hardly hear myself think over the incredible noise, a screeching sound that reminded me of thousands of steamships venting their boilers at once. We were about to be swallowed whole when, at the last second, the wind died down. It was surreal to suddenly be enveloped in calmness, and I attempted to catch my breath. Once I had a second to take it all in, my surroundings, the stunning beauty of the moonlit scene, I saw we weren't alone. Items floated all around us, pieces of other boats, barrels, debris, evidence of everything the whirlpool had consumed. It filled me with a strange curiosity. I began to wonder how long each of them would last before the depths claimed their final resting places. While we circled, I was struck by the idea that many of the flotsam would be pushed back up to the surface once the tide changed. I was consumed with a fascinating sense of determination in that moment, making room for hope. I thought of all the objects catching myself up on our surroundings as we ventured deeper, and I witnessed how they twisted around us, noticing the shapes they took. Soon, a plan formed in my mind. I needed to tie myself to a floating barrel, break away from the boat, and ride the currents to safety. I signaled my brother to help me, but his face reflected pure terror. In sheer desperation, he released the hold he had and tried to grab me, but I wouldn't let him wrest control of the ring bolt from me. I made my decision. I dashed for the barrel, lashed myself to it, and launched myself out into the depths. As I dropped, I expected the worst, but as I clung to the barrel, I suddenly felt steadied. I soon noticed the chaos above had shifted. I had performed the leap of faith, choosing to trust the instincts I never knew I possessed. The barrel remained buoyant beneath me, despite the swirling foam all around. It's hard to say when it happened, but some time passed as I floated towards the surface, emerging among the wreckage of the whirlpool. At last, I saw black water surrounding the familiar shores of Lofoden, where I had once spent my life. Lucky for me, my escape was just in time. A fishing boat picked me up, utterly exhausted and speechless from the horror I'd witnessed. My friends, a crew I'd known my entire life, didn't recognize me. My hair, once dark, was white as snow. They claimed I looked entirely different. I recounted my tale, but they simply brushed it off as madness. I now tell you, and I know it sounds unbelievable, but it's the truth of my experience. My escape from the Maelstrom was one of the wildest moments of my life, and I doubt anyone will ever truly understand what I went through that day.